Thanks, everybody. First off, I'd like to thank the other speakers and the organizers, and especially Jim, for putting all this together. It's really cool, you guys. Thanks a lot. So I'd like to first go back to the initial question that we started with, what is skepticism, and talk about that for a little bit, and then briefly talk about a new sort of argument for skepticism. You might have heard, like, maybe, how do you know we're not in the Matrix, that sort of argument. This argument's going to be different from that.
Are you going to be using the projector?
No, I'm not. So. Thanks. Okay, so Jeff had mentioned before during his presentation that one way to understand skepticism is as a sort of attitude, so like a questioning attitude that you have towards certain topics or towards certain issues. But there's another way to understand skepticism as well. It's to understand it as like what sort of claim you would have to accept in order to be a skeptic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that at first. So skeptical claims will be typically claims of the form subject S doesn't know proposition P. And these sorts of claims can vary interestingly along two sorts of dimensions. One of them has to do with the proposition in question that we don't have knowledge of, or that we don't have knowledge of according to the skeptic. In the broadest stroke, the proposition could be any proposition. That could be a global skepticism. It could say we don't know anything at all. But there could be limited forms of skepticism as well. So perhaps pertaining to a certain topic. So some people think that we can't have knowledge of religious claims, or that we can't have knowledge of ethical claims, or maybe we can't have knowledge of future claims, for instance. As a specific example, I take it that there's a truth about the amount of change in this room right now. Not change in like some abstract sense, but like were we to empty our pockets onto the table and count it all, we could figure out the amount of change that the people in this room have right now. Now, I take it that none of us knows what that amount is, so in a very limited way, all of us should be at least limited skeptics, because there's this true proposition concerning the amount of change that's in the room right now, and none of us do know it. But skeptical claims can also vary interestingly along another dimension, the strength of the knowledge claim, or how irremediable our ignorance is with respect to the proposition. With respect to the change proposition, it's pretty easily remediable, right? We could figure it out pretty quickly and pretty easily. So the weakest sort of claim, a skeptical claim, is one that just says, we in fact don't know. But that doesn't imply anything about whether or not we can know, or it's within our kin to know, or anything like that. A stronger sort of claim would say, it's beyond our kin to be able to know, so we are not capable of knowing. But perhaps different sorts of beings could know, or something like that. So consider, for example, the claim that no person can run a kilometer in under a minute, let's say. The claim there is that it's not within our abilities to run the kilometer in under a minute without some sort of enhancement. Maybe if we were enhanced robotically in some way, or if we were a different species like a cheetah, then we could do it, that'd be just fine. But as it happens, it's beyond our abilities, unaided, to do that sort of thing. So this sort of strength of skeptical claim would be like that, like the we can't run the kilometer in a minute claim. It would say it's beyond our abilities to know. So an example is some skeptics about moral claims are skeptics about them because they say, look, we can't know truths about morality because that would require maybe knowing the mind of God, which we can't do, or perhaps we'd have to know all future outcomes of an action in order to know whether or not it was right or wrong, and we can't do that either. So these skeptics about morality have this sort of strength of claim. They're saying it's beyond our kin, it's beyond our ability to know these sorts of things. So it's a stronger claim than the claim that, the sort of claim that we don't know the amount of change in the room. We don't have the ability to do it, but maybe somebody else would. Maybe smarter beings could do it, maybe God could do it, but we can't. Now, the strongest sort of skeptical claim would be one that says it's impossible to have knowledge of a certain sort of domain of propositions. So that would be akin to the way in which it's impossible to be a married bachelor, say. So it's not like if you try harder or if you're more resourceful, you could end up being a married bachelor. You just can't do it. So the very strongest form of skeptical claim is one that just says knowledge is like that. It's like trying to know something is like trying to become a married bachelor. It's impossible to do. There's something contradictory in the notion of knowing something. So I think if we think of skeptical claims as varying along these two sorts of dimensions about how wide-ranging the class of propositions is that isn't known, and what sort of strength the knowledge claim is, whether it's just that we in fact don't know, or that it's beyond our abilities, or that it's beyond anyone's abilities, generate lots and lots and lots of different possible skeptical views. And since clearly all of us endorse some sorts of forms of limited skepticism about what we don't in fact know, there's a sense in which all of us are skeptics then. So the reason I introduce the distinctions is so we can think more about not whether we're skeptics or not, but what sort of skeptics are we? Are we just skeptics that say we don't in fact know things, but perhaps it's not beyond our abilities? Or do we say it's beyond our abilities, or do we say it's beyond our abilities because it's impossible? Which of those strengths and which class of propositions? So that's just to help perhaps clear a little bit of ground about how to think about what sort of skeptic you are, given that you're some sort of skeptic or other. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was why be a skeptic of a certain sort, a certain particular sort. So this sort of argument depends upon noting a couple of things about reasonableness itself at the outset. So oftentimes we hear claims like different reasonable parties can agree to disagree about a certain conclusion. After looking at all the evidence, they say P, they say not P. Both of them are reasonable and can go about their business. I think that that's actually not true. I don't think it's possible for you to reasonably disagree under certain circumstances. So to get at what the thought's supposed to be, think about what it takes to be reasonable in the first place. I think a fairly plausible claim about what it takes is that you're reasonable in believing something when that thing is supported by your evidence. And now the question is going to be figuring out whether or not your evidence supports the particular thing you believe, right? So it's not just a matter of having your evidence support it, but it's that you're able to recognize that that's what your evidence supports and believe it on that basis. So if that's roughly what it takes to have a reasonable belief, then suppose you sit down with someone who disagrees with you and you share all of your evidence. Then you have the same body of evidence that's either supporting your view or supporting the view of your opponent. Now, if you and your opponent are equally smart, you're equally good at figuring out which proposition is the one that's supported by the evidence. So to take a concrete example, I assume the room is not bursting with theists. So suppose we were to find, as we certainly can do, an expert about theistic arguments, an expert about arguments for and against the existence of God, let's say. And we were to bring this person in. There's no question about their smartness. They're an expert. They're smart. And then we discuss with them. We say, look, these are my reasons for believing God doesn't exist. And they say, well, these are my reasons for believing God does exist. And so on and so forth. At the end of this big discussion, we share the same body of evidence. If we don't leave anything out, if you don't hold anything back, the same bits of evidence are on the table. And it'll either be the case that that evidence supports the belief that God exists, or it doesn't support that. Now, under the assumption that you're as smart as the expert that you brought in to discuss the issue of God with, if the expert still, at the end of the day, says, this evidence supports belief in God, and you say, this evidence does not support belief in God, then think about the recipe here. The recipe says, it's evidence plus figuring out what your evidence supports. If we share the evidence, and if we admit that the expert is as smart as we are, then we know somebody's going wrong here. Either you're wrong about what the evidence supports, or your opponent's wrong about what the evidence supports. But if we agree we have the same evidence, and we come to different conclusions about what it supports, then it means one of us is going wrong, and if they're as smart, we have no way of telling whether it's us that's screwing up or it's them that's screwing up. And if that's right, then putting all that together gives us that it seems like the only reasonable thing we could do in that situation is suspend judgment about whether or not the evidence in fact supports the claim that God exists. So it seems like even with beliefs that we might initially be hostile to, maybe all of us in this room are hostile to it, like the claim that God exists, let's say. Perhaps if we're going to be serious about what reasonableness requires, if we could be in the situation where we share our evidence and an expert disagrees with us who's at least as smart as us about it, then perhaps the only reasonable attitude would be to suspend judgment about even a belief like whether or not God exists. Thanks.
Time for questions, yeah.
Okay, good.
Comments?
I have a question. I'm just trying to frame it.
I think I'm about 5 minutes back still.
Yeah.
So, Are you saying that like absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence? Like, I'm just trying to take all that in.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't say a lot about what evidence is or isn't, right? I just said having a reasonable belief is going to be a matter of your evidence supporting that belief. Now, we can have a different debate about what sorts of things are evidence, but I could just grant you whatever you think evidence is, and then we can share that evidence with the theistic expert, right? So put in whatever you like. As long as we can share it with the other person, we can get ourselves in this situation where we can't reasonably believe the opposite of what they say. That's the idea.
Well, it just seems to me that reasonably, I guess it goes to what they were talking about faith before. If you can just throw your hands up and say, you know what, well, we just have to suspend judgment, you could probably put that with any claim. I mean, you have to evidence has to be based on reality, really. And it just, I don't know, I'm a little confused of what you're saying. I know this talk is, I can't frame trying to frame a question here too. If we're going to say that whatever it is ultimately unknowable, then how do we get to knowing anything? That's probably the wrong way to put it.
Okay, so let me try to put it a little bit more concretely then. So here's the sort of thing I'm thinking about. Let's suppose that we agree for the sake of argument, the only things that are relevant to whether or not God exists are, let's say, arguments for or against the existence of God. Right? So then I think up my best arguments against, the theist thinks up their best arguments for, and then we get together and we have a discussion. We share our arguments, we share our reasons for believing each of the premises. So this is all reasons-based, nothing's being particularly faith-based. So perhaps they still believe on the basis of faith, but if they claim that the evidence, actually, the reason supports their view, then the idea would be, if we've shared all of our arguments and thereby shared all of our evidence, then if we disagree afterwards, one of us is messing up about what the evidence actually supports. So whether or not God exists, we could still have arguments about whether or not God exists. Yeah. So if these are the parts that are the evidence, if we share those and we disagree about what they support, and I admit that that person is just as smart as I am, just as good at assessing what the evidence is, then I can't tell whether it's me that's going wrong or it's the other person that's going wrong. And if that's the case, then we don't have good reason to think that the evidence in fact supports whatever our preferred position is. So if my preferred position is to maintain that God doesn't exist, I lose justification for that by sharing my evidence with somebody else who's at least as smart as me and comes to the opposite conclusion. That's part of the idea.
I think I need to take a class.
Sorry, I was trying to be quick because I know we're behind ourselves. So,
But we were kind of preparing for being late anyway, so.
I'm just curious about default positions. So, for example, if I claim that Russell's teapot is orbiting Venus, say, and it can't be detected on any scanners because we don't have the right resolution, is it my opponent's job to disprove that proposition, or is it my job to prove it, or do we share the burden of proof?
Part of my thought was, maybe I snuck it in, but part of my thought was, whatever it is for you to have a reasonable belief is going to involve what your evidence supports. So if that's right, then you don't get any reasonableness for free. So you don't get a default proposition that you just get to be reasonable in believing. You only get to be reasonable in believing something if you have evidence for it.
So in this case, you're saying that the suggesting that Russell's teapot exists would be wrong unless you had any evidence to start with that suggested it actually was there, not just the fact that we can't disprove that it's not there.
But so would the proposition that it isn't there would be equally wrong, right? Or
yeah, because I guess what you assume is default evidence for the teapot not being there is how could there be a teapot there?
So
Sorry.
so let's suppose for fun that you believe no teapot orbits any planetary body, and I believe for some odd reason that a planet has as one of its orbiters a teapot, right? So suppose I'm trying to pull this move on you to get you to suspend judgment and become a skeptic about whether or not teapots orbit things, right? So then what we need to do is share what our reasons are for our beliefs. And so if I say, well, you know, my dowsing rod indicated to me that teapots are the sorts of things that circle planets and stuff like that, right? Then you've got a reason to reject what I'm claiming as my evidence in that case, right? So
It's not reasonable.
right,
Yeah.
right. So it involves this tricky question about figuring out what exactly is the evidence for a proposition, which is a pretty tough thing. But the thought is, if we could grant that bit, if we grant that we share evidence, then there's going to be a unique thing that evidence supports. Either it's going to support teapots circle planets, or it's not going to. And I imagine, since we have absolutely no reason to believe that there are teapots orbiting planets, and no one jettisoned a teapot with the right sort of trajectory for it to do that sort of thing, then that would be some evidence in favor of the proposition that teapots don't orbit planets. So I think that you would win then there, and we wouldn't get this epistemic symmetry that would make us have to give up. But I think in other cases it's tough. I mean, there are really smart theists. There are really smart people that probably disagree with you entirely politically, for instance, and are aware of all your reasons for your view, and are aware of all the objections that you have to their view, but still disagree with you. So I think that in cases like this, it's hard to see how to avoid being a skeptic.
Well, I do want to hear all the talks, so. And we don't know how long it's going to take to do the UFO thing. Because I take it that's a demonstration, right? Was there any other really, really strong questions that...
I have just one. Just
Okay.
one. I was trying to think how to frame it. But basically, what I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, Lee, is that if the evidence is the same and the arguments are what are different, that agnosticism about that question, if that's the right term, is what's reasonable in this case.
My thought is, if the evidence is the same and the conclusions are different,
Right.
and you
Yeah.
think you have just as good reason to think that the other person's as good at assessing the evidence as you are, then it seems like agnosticism is the only reasonable position you could take there. It's the only position that's supported by your total evidence in that situation.
Could I ask one really quick question on that? Would you admit that it might be an overly artificial construct, and if you apply it to reality, usually what it comes down to is quibbling over things that, you know, you still believe that your argument is sound, and they still believe that their argument is sound, but you're both kind of arguing over nuance. And so rather than accepting that this potentially artificial construct where you have both agreed on all of the knowledge and everything is built up, and then have two different
This
conclusions.
is because in real life you wouldn't accept that your opponent is as smart as you are.
Or you at least
So you have no evidence for
Or you at
it.
least wouldn't know that they were. And so, if you apply this to reality, the assumption would be if you disagree with the smart person, you would conclude nothing, whereas...
Good. I worry that unlike most things in philosophy, this actually gets worse when we apply it to reality. So if I'm being honest, I'll admit that all sorts of people that disagree with me about all sorts of different topics are actually much more well informed about those topics and much better than I am at reasoning about those topics that I simply don't know as much about. So I think it actually makes it worse on the ground. I'm afraid it might be a lot more widespread.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.